Daniel Carter's hands were bound behind his back as the transport shuttle descended through thick purple clouds. He stared out the window at the alien landscape below, watching massive canyon systems cut through dense forests like scars on green flesh. 3 weeks ago, he had been hauling medical supplies to a mining colony. Now he was about to die on a planet he had never meant to visit. The crash had not been his fault. An asteroid field appeared on sensors too late, and his navigation system failed during evasive maneuvers. When he woke up in the wreckage, his distress beacon was already broadcasting. But instead of rescue, the Galactic Council arrived with accusations. Havros 9 was a protected wildlife preserve. No unauthorized landings permitted. No exceptions. Quillnath sat across from him in the shuttle. She was Havrosian, her skin covered in fine scales that shifted from blue to silver depending on the light. As wildlife director for this sector, she had personally requested this method of execution. Her 3 eyes never left his face, studying him like one of her research specimens. "You understand what awaits you," she said. It was not a question. Daniel nodded once. They had explained it thoroughly. Trial by nature, they called it. He would be released into the deep valleys with nothing but basic clothes. The Shade Ripper would find him within hours. The creature had killed 47 trained Havrosian hunters over the past decade. Plasma weapons barely scratched its armored hide. It hunted by sensing fear and adrenaline, drawn to prey like a shark to blood and water. Most humans would be begging, Quillnath observed, offering bribes, claiming diplomatic immunity. Would it matter? Daniel asked quietly. She tilted her head, an almost reptilian gesture. No. Then why waste the words? The shuttle touched down in a clearing surrounded by towering trees with black bark and silver leaves. 2 guards escorted Daniel to the exit ramp. One of them removed his restraints. The other handed him a canteen of water. Nothing else. "If you have family," Quillnath said from the doorway, "we will inform them you died in the crash. It is more merciful than the truth." Daniel rubbed his wrists where the restraints had chafed. "I have a sister in New Seattle. Tell her I was thinking about our grandmother at the end." Quillnath made a notation on her datapad. "It will be done." The shuttle lifted off, leaving Daniel alone in the clearing. The forest around him was silent, except for wind moving through the canopy. No birds, no insects, nothing. The local wildlife knew better than to make noise when the Shade Ripper was hunting that he could run. Try to find shelter, maybe last a few extra hours. But Daniel had grown up in the Alaskan wilderness with his grandmother after his parents died. She had taught him that panic killed faster than any predator. Think first. Assess the situation. Find water. Find shelter. Make a plan that a stream ran along the western edge of the clearing. Daniel knelt beside it and drank deeply, then filled his canteen. The water was cold and tasted faintly mineral. Good enough. He followed the stream north until he found a spot where 2 large boulders leaned together, creating a natural windbreak. Not much protection from a 12-foot predator, but would keep him dry if it rained. Dead branches littered the forest floor. Daniel gathered an armload and carried them back to his shelter site. His grandmother had made him practice fire starting without tools until he could do it in under 10 minutes. He found a flat piece of wood and a straight stick, carve a notch with a sharp stone, and began spinning the stick between his palms. His hands blistered. His shoulders burned. But eventually smoke rose from the friction point. Then a tiny ember glowed in the tinder. Daniel transferred it carefully to a nest of dry grass and blew gently until flames appeared. He fed the fire slowly, building it up until heat pushed back the evening chill. Dinner was harder. He had no fishing line, no hooks, no net. But the stream was shallow in places, and Daniel remembered his grandmother showing him how to build a fish trap from stones and sticks. It took an hour to construct a small weir that funneled fish into a shallow pool. By the time darkness fell, he had caught 3 silver-scaled fish about the size of trout. He cooked them on flat stones near the fire, eating slowly. The meat was bland but filling. Protein, energy, survival. Quillnath was probably watching from orbit right now, waiting for the screaming to start, waiting for the Shade Ripper to tear him apart. Daniel looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to appear between the branches. He wondered if his grandmother would be proud or disappointed. She had taught him to respect all life, to understand that every creature was just trying to survive, even the one that was coming to kill him. The first roar echoed through the canyon just after midnight. It was deep and resonant, a sound that vibrated in Daniel's chest and made his fire flicker. Not close yet, maybe half a mile away, but getting closer. Daniel added more wood to the fire and settled back against the boulder. His heart was pounding, but he forced his breathing to slow. Fear was a signal. The Shade Ripper could sense it like a beacon. If he was going to die, he would die calm. The roar came again, closer this time. Daniel closed his eyes and thought about his grandmother's cabin. The smell of pine and wood smoke. The sound of wolves howling in the distance. She used to say that animals were not evil or good. They were just alive, following their nature. Every creature is just trying to survive, she had told him once while bandaging a wounded fox. Just like you. Daniel opened his eyes and stared into the darkness beyond his fire. Somewhere out there, the Shade Ripper was tracking him. The apex predator of an alien world. The creature that even trained hunters could not kill. That he took a drink from his canteen and waited for morning. Sunlight filtered through the silver leaves and woke Daniel from shallow sleep. He sat up carefully, every muscle stiff from sleeping on rocky ground. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. He was still alive. That was unexpected. Fresh scratches marked the tree trunks around his camp. Deep gouges in the black bark, each one as wide as Daniel's palm. The Shade Ripper had been here, circled his shelter multiple times, judging by the tracks. Four-toed prints pressed into the soft earth near the stream, each one bigger than a dinner plate. But the creature had not attacked. Daniel rebuilt his fire and checked his fish trap. 2 more silver fish waited in the shallow pool. He cooked them while trying to understand why he was not dead. The Shade Ripper should have killed him in the darkness. Easy prey, alone and unarmed. But it had walked away. High above the planet, Quillnath stared at her monitor screens in disbelief. The overnight footage showed the Shade Ripper approaching Daniel's camp 4 separate times. Each time it had stopped at the edge of the firelight, watched, then retreated into the forest. Thermal imaging showed the human's heart rate elevated but stable. No panic response. No flood of fear hormones. This makes no sense, she muttered to Doctor. Helvin floated over to her station. He was Quellen, a species that looked like someone had crossed a dolphin with a scholar. His translator implant clicked softly. Perhaps the Shade Ripper is simply not hungry. It is always hungry, Quillnath snapped. That is its nature. Then perhaps we do not understand its nature as well as we believe. Quillnath glared at him but said nothing. She increased the magnification on her screen, watching the human gather materials from the forest. He moved deliberately, calmly, showing no signs of the terror that should be consuming him. It was unnatural. Daniel spent the morning improving his shelter and exploring the immediate area. The canyon system was beautiful in its own harsh way. Cliffs rose on both sides, their faces streaked with mineral deposits that gleamed red and gold. The forest followed the valley floor, thick with undergrowth and strange flowers that smelled like cinnamon. He found berry bushes and carefully tested them using the universal edibility test his grandmother had taught him. Rub on skin, wait. Touch to lips, wait. Small taste, wait. Most made him spit immediately, but one variety seemed safe. He gathered a handful and brought them back to camp out on the 3rd day. The Shade Ripper appeared in daylight. Daniel was gutting fish by the stream when movement caught his eye. He looked up slowly and forgot how to breathe. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, massive and terrifying. 12 feet tall at the shoulder with 6 limbs arranged along a serpentine body. Its hide was covered in overlapping scales that shifted color from black to deep purple, like oil on water. The head was triangular with 3 eyes arranged in a forward-facing cluster, each one glowing like molten copper. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to run. His muscles tensed. His heart hammered against his ribs. But he forced himself to remain still, to breathe slowly, to think instead of react. The Shade Ripper had not attacked yet. It was just watching him, Then Daniel noticed the way it held its middle left limb. The leg dragged slightly, and the scales around the joint were discolored. Dark fluid seeped from a wound that looked infected. The creature was injured badly. Understanding hit Daniel like cold water. The Shade Ripper had been circling his camp, not because it was stalking prey. It had been trying to decide if he was a threat. An injured predator was a vulnerable predator. It could not afford a fight. Slowly, very slowly, Daniel set down his knife. He picked up his canteen and placed it on the ground between himself and the creature. Then he backed away carefully, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. No sudden gestures, no direct eye contact, just like approaching a wounded bear. The Shade Ripper watched him retreat, its head tilted slightly, processing this strange behavior. When Daniel was 20 feet away, he sat down on a rock and waited. Just waited, making no move to advance or flee. An hour passed. The creature shifted its weight, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, it limped forward to the canteen. The injured limb buckled slightly, and the Shade Ripper made a low sound, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. It sniffed the canteen, then used one foreclaw to tip it over. Water spilled across the ground. The creature lapped at it carefully. When the water was gone, the Shade Ripper looked directly at Daniel. The copper eyes seemed to glow brighter. Then the creature turned and limped back into the forest, moving slower than it should. Daniel released a breath he had not realized he was holding. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system after the fact. But he was alive. The apex predator had drunk from his canteen and walked away. On the observation station, chaos erupted. Quillnath was shouting at her console while Dr. Helvin tried to calm her down. Other researchers crowded around the screens, replaying the footage again and again. He fed it, Quillnath hissed. The human is manipulating the apex predator. He gave it water, Dr. Helvin corrected, and only after observing its injury. I believe he was showing compassion. Compassion? Quillnath's scales flushed dark red. This proves humans are more dangerous than we thought. They corrupt natural behavior. They domesticate and destroy. Dr. Helvin studied the screen where Daniel sat by his fire, staring into the flames. Or perhaps they simply recognize suffering in another living being. Is that not what we claim to do as researchers? Quillnath pulled up a communication channel to the Galactic Council. I am requesting an emergency session. The human's execution must be completed by other means. This experiment has been compromised, but the council representative was already watching the same footage. Negative. Continue observation. We need to understand what is happening here. The human's execution is postponed until further analysis. Quillnath closed the channel and turned back to her monitors. The human was cleaning fish again, as if he had not just faced death. As if offering water to a creature that should have torn him apart was perfectly normal behavior. She increased surveillance protocols and settled in to watch. If the human was manipulating the Shade Ripper, she would document every moment. And when she had proof of contamination, the council would authorize permanent termination. Daniel cooked his dinner and ate slowly. The Shade Ripper did not return that night, but he could hear it moving through the forest. The sounds were different now, less like hunting, more like patrolling, as if the creature was guarding the territory rather than stalking it. He lay down near his fire and looked up at the stars. His grandmother had once rehabilitated a wolf with a broken leg. It had taken weeks of patient work, leaving food at a distance, never forcing contact. Eventually, the wolf had trusted her enough to accept treatment. Every creature is just trying to survive, Daniel whispered to the darkness. Somewhere in the canyon, the Shade Ripper roared. It sounded less threatening than before, almost like an answer. The Shade Ripper came to the clearing every day now, always in late afternoon when shadows grew long across the canyon floor. It would emerge from the forest and settle at the edge of Daniel's camp, massive body coiled like a resting dragon. Sometimes it stayed for an hour, sometimes until sunset. Daniel continued his routine as if a 12-foot apex predator was not watching his every move. He caught fish and cooked them over his fire. He gathered berries and edible roots. He improved his shelter by weaving branches together to create a better roof. Normal activities, Predictable patterns. Nothing threatening. On the fifth day of these visits, Daniel left extra fish on a flat rock between his fire and where the creature usually rested. The Shade Ripper approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, then consumed it in 2 bites. The next day, Daniel left 2 fish. Then 3. The wound on the creature's limb was getting worse. Green fluid leaked from the infected joint, and the scales around it had turned gray. The Shade Ripper moved slower each day, favoring the injured leg more obviously. Daniel knew what untreated infection meant. Even an apex predator could not survive blood poisoning forever. He spent a morning searching the forest for the right plants. His grandmother had taught him basic field medicine, showing him which plants had antiseptic properties. The species here were different, but ecology followed patterns. He found something similar to yarrow growing near the stream, and a moss that smelled astringent when crushed. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Daniel prepared a poultice by grinding the plants between 2 rocks and mixing them with water until he had a thick paste. He smeared some on his own arm first, testing for allergic reaction. His skin reddened slightly, but nothing worse. Good enough. The hard part would be convincing the Shade Ripper to let him approach. When the creature arrived that afternoon, Daniel was ready. He had the poultice in a carved wooden bowl and clean strips of fabric torn from his shirt. He sat by his fire and waited until the Shade Ripper settled into its usual spot. Then slowly, very slowly, he stood up. The creature's eyes tracked him immediately, its body tense, claws extending for massive paws. Daniel kept his movements careful and deliberate. He scooped some poultice onto his fingers and made a show of rubbing it on his own arm, miming the action of treating a wound. Then he held up the bowl so the Shade Ripper could see it. He took 1 step forward, stopped, waited. The creature watched him but did not retreat or attack. Daniel took another step, then another. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every prey instinct he possessed screamed at him to back away from the massive predator. But he kept moving forward, talking in a low, steady voice. "Easy now. I know it hurts. Just trying to help. Easy." The words did not matter. The tone did. Calm, gentle, no threat. Daniel reached the Shade Ripper and knelt beside the injured limb. As close he could see just how badly infected it was. The wound looked like something had bitten deep and torn, probably during a territorial fight. The flesh was swollen and hot to touch. Without treatment, the creature would be dead within days. He scooped fresh poultice from the bowl and reached toward the wound. The Shade Ripper made a sound deep in its chest, a vibration Daniel felt through the ground. But it held still, trusting or simply too weak to flee. Daniel did not know. Did not care. He cleaned the wound as gently as possible, removing dead tissue and draining infection. Green fluid stained his hands. The Shade Ripper trembled but never pulled away. Daniel applied the poultice thickly, covering the entire wound, then wrapped it with strips of fabric. The whole process took nearly an hour. By the end, his hands were shaking and sweat dripped down his back despite the cool evening air. When he finished, Daniel backed away slowly and returned to his fire. He washed his hands in the stream, scrubbing until they were raw. When he looked up, the Shade Ripper was staring at him. Then the massive creature did something unexpected. It lowered its head until its nose nearly touched the ground, holding the position for several seconds before raising back up. Daniel had seen wolves do the same thing. A gesture of submission or respect. "You are welcome," he said quietly. High above the planet, Quillnath watched the footage for the 10th time. She had transmitted it to the Galactic Council with her own commentary about human contamination and ecosystem disruption. The response had not been what she expected. Dr. Helvin floated beside her, reviewing the biological data. The Shade Ripper's stress hormones have dropped 40% since the human treated its wound. Heart rate is stabilizing. The infection markers in its blood are already decreasing. Because the human manipulated it, Quillnath insisted. This is exactly what their species does. They insert themselves into natural systems and corrupt them, or save them, Dr. Helvin suggested. That creature would have died from infection. Now, it has a chance at survival. It should have died naturally. That is the way of nature. Dr. Helvin turned to look at her with his large, gentle eyes. Is it natural for us to observe and never intervene? We claim to be scientists, yet we treat these creatures like they exist for our entertainment. That human showed more respect for the Shade Ripper's life than we have in 10 years of research. Quillnath had no response to that. She turned back to her screens, watching Daniel prepare his evening meal while the Shade Ripper rested near his fire. The creature was closer tonight, near enough that firelight reflected off its scales. Near enough for comfort rather than observation. Over the next 3 days, the Shade Ripper's condition improved dramatically. The swelling decreased, and the scales around the wound began returning to their normal color. The creature moved with more confidence, putting weight on the injured limb without obvious pain, and it brought gifts. The first was a cluster of crystalline formations, pale blue and perfectly geometric. The Shade Ripper carried them carefully in its mouth and placed them near Daniel's shelter. The next day, it brought colorful feathers from some bird species Daniel had not seen. Then a smooth stone worn round by water. Daniel recognized the behavior from his grandmother's stories. Pack animals brought offerings to family members. Mates exchanged gifts during bonding. The Shade Ripper was treating him as part of its social structure. On the 8th night, Daniel sat by his fire cooking fish when the creature approached closer than ever before. It settled down beside the fire, close enough that Daniel could feel heat radiating from its massive body. The two of them sat in silence, human and predator, sharing warmth as stars appeared overhead. Daniel reached out slowly and rested his hand on the Shade Ripper's scaled shoulder. The creature made a low, rumbling sound, almost like a purr. Its copper eyes closed halfway in what might have been contentment. For the first time since the crash, Daniel felt something other than fear or determination. He felt connection, understanding. He had come to this planet expecting to die alone. Instead, he had found something impossible: family. The roar that woke Daniel was different from any sound his companion had made. Deeper, more aggressive, a challenge echoing through the canyon system like thunder. He sat up fast. His fire burned down to embers in the pre-dawn darkness. The Shade Ripper that had been sleeping near his shelter was already standing, every muscle tensed. Another roar answered from the south. Closer. Daniel scrambled to his feet as his companion charged into the forest without looking back. Crash of breaking branches and furious snarls filled the air. Then the unmistakable sound of massive bodies colliding with earth-shaking force. He should stay at camp, should let nature take its course. But the thought of his companion fighting alone made his chest tight. Daniel grabbed a thick branch from his firewood pile, thrust one end into the coals until it caught flame, then ran toward the sounds of battle. The two Shade Rippers fought in a narrow section of the canyon where cliffs rose on both sides. The newcomer was younger, slightly smaller, but moving with vicious speed. It had bright green patterns along its scales that flashed as it moved. Daniel's companion tried to hold its ground, but the injured limb was still weak. The challenger pressed the advantage, driving forward with slashing claws and snapping jaws. Daniel watched from the tree line, torch held high. The creatures moved too fast for him to follow individual strikes. They were blurs of scales and fury, tearing chunks from the earth where they collided. His companion landed a solid hit across the challenger's face, but took a worse wound across its chest in return. Blood that looked almost black in the dim light spattered across the rocks. The younger Shade Ripper forced his companion back against the cliff wall. It reared up, preparing for a killing strike. Daniel's body moved before his brain caught up. He ran forward screaming, waving the burning torch above his head like a madman. The challenger turned its head toward this small, unexpected threat. 3 copper eyes focused on Daniel, and the creature's lips pulled back, revealing teeth like daggers. It took a step toward him, away from its opponent, and that was all the opening his companion needed. The injured Shade Ripper slammed into the challenger from the side with every ounce of remaining strength. The two creatures rolled across the canyon floor in a tangle of limbs and tails. Daniel kept advancing, kept shouting, using fire to create a second front. The challenger found itself caught between flame and fury. It broke away suddenly. backing toward the southern end of the canyon. Blood dripped from multiple wounds. It roared once more, a promise that this was not over, then disappeared into the forest. Daniel's companion collapsed where it stood. Its breathing came in ragged gasps, and fresh blood poured from the wound across its chest. Daniel dropped the torch and ran to the creature's side. The injury was bad, a long, deep gash that had split scales and torn muscle beneath. That he had nothing. No medical supplies. No bandages. But he could not just stand there and watch his companion bleed out. Daniel stripped off his shirt and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure. The Shade Ripper made a low sound of pain, but did not pull away. "Stay with me," Daniel said. "Come on, stay with me." He maintained pressure for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The bleeding slowed, but did not stop completely. Daniel looked around desperately for anything that might help. He remembered stories his grandmother told about using pine sap as antiseptic and seal for wounds. The trees here had similar bark. It was worth trying. He left his shirt pressed against the wound and ran to the nearest tree. Used a sharp rock to score the bark until sticky, clear sap began flowing. He collected it in his cupped hands and hurried back. The Shade Ripper watched him through half-closed eyes, breath shallow and rapid. Daniel removed the blood-soaked shirt and quickly smeared sap across the entire wound, sealing it as best he could. It was crude field medicine, but better than nothing. He tore more strips from his ruined shirt and wrapped them around the creature's chest, holding everything in place. When he finished, the Shade Ripper made that low, rumbling sound again. Then it moved its massive head toward Daniel, pushing against his chest with surprising gentleness. The gesture was unmistakable. Trust, gratitude, affection. Daniel wrapped his arms around the creature's neck, feeling scales warm beneath his touch and the steady beat of its heart. "You are not allowed to die," he whispered. "Not after everything." They stayed like that as dawn broke over the canyon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Eventually, the Shade Ripper struggled to its feet, moving carefully to avoid tearing the wound. It limped back toward Daniel's camp with him walking alongside, ready to provide support if needed. On the observation station, the emergency alarms had been going off for the past hour. Quillnath stood at her command console, watching footage of the fight, the human's intervention, the aftermath. Her scales kept shifting colors, unable to settle on a single emotional state. "That should not have happened," she said flatly. "We released the second Shade Ripper to restore natural order. The human corrupted it." Dr. Helvin pulled up biological data on both creatures. The younger one challenged for territory as expected. What was unexpected was the human defending his companion, and the companion defending the human in turn. Exactly. Corrupted natural behavior, or evolved social behavior we never observed because we kept them isolated. Dr. Helvin highlighted sections of the data. Look at the hormone profiles. Both creatures are showing pack bonding markers. The human did not create this behavior. He simply triggered what was already there. Quillnath opened a channel to the Galactic Council. A counselor appeared on screen, already reviewing the same footage. "Director Quillnath, we saw the incident. The experiment must end," Quillnath said immediately. "The human is too disruptive. We need to extract him before further contamination." The counselor was quiet for a long moment. The data suggests something else entirely. That human just risked his life to defend a creature that was supposed to execute him. And that creature defended him in return. This is not contamination. This is unprecedented interspecies cooperation. It undermines our entire preservation protocol. Perhaps our protocol needs revision. The counselor leaned forward. "Continue observation, but effective immediately. The human's death sentence is suspended pending full analysis. We need to understand what we are seeing here." Quillnath wanted to argue, but the channel closed. She turned back to her screens where Daniel was helping the injured Shade Ripper settle near his shelter. He rebuilt his fire, checked the creature's wounds, offered water. The Shade Ripper watched him with what could only be described as trust. "This is wrong," Quillnath muttered to Dr. Helvin did not respond. He simply watched as human and predator rested side by side, two beings that should have been enemies finding comfort in each other's presence. "Wrong or not, It was beautiful. Daniel sat with his back against the Shade Ripper's warm flank, feeling the steady rhythm of its breathing. The challenger would return eventually. These things always came back. But for now, they were safe. Together, he looked down at his torn and bloody hands, then up at the alien sky. His grandmother would have loved this. A wounded predator and a castaway human, surviving against impossible odds through simple compassion. Every creature is just trying to survive, he whispered into the morning air. The Shade Ripper's rumble of agreement vibrated through his spine. The diplomatic shuttle descended through morning clouds exactly 2 weeks after the fight with the Challenger. Daniel saw it coming from a mile away, its silver hull reflecting sunlight as it dropped toward the canyon. He had known this moment would arrive eventually. The Galactic Council would not let this situation continue indefinitely. The Shade Ripper lifted its head from where it rested near the fire. The chest wound had healed remarkably well, leaving only a pale scar beneath the scales. The creature was strong again, moving without pain. It made a questioning sound deep in its throat, sensing Daniel's tension. "Company," Daniel said quietly. "Official kind." 3 figures emerged from the shuttle when it landed in the clearing. Quillnath came first, her scales shifting nervously through shades of blue and gray. Dr. Helvin floated beside her, his translator clicking softly. Behind them walked 3 council arbiters in formal robes, their faces unreadable behind ceremonial masks. Daniel stood to meet them, very aware that he was shirtless and barefoot with 2 weeks of beard growth and dirt under his fingernails. The Shade Ripper moved to stand beside him, its massive form positioned protectively. Not threatening, but clearly making a statement. Quillnath stopped 10 feet away, her 3 eyes fixed on the creature. "We need to discuss your situation, human. My name is Daniel." She acknowledged this with a slight head tilt. "Daniel Carter. The Council has reviewed all observation data from your time on Havros 9. We have come to render judgment on your sentence and on the complications that have arisen." One of the arbiters stepped forward. Their voice resonated with authority. "Daniel Carter, you were sentenced to death for trespassing in a protected zone. That sentence has been carried out in spirit, if not in fact. You have survived trial by nature through unprecedented means." "How does it not die?" Daniel said. "Is that a crime?" "You have fundamentally altered the behavior of an apex predator," Quillnath interjected. "Shade Rippers are solitary aggressive hunters. This one now exhibits pack bonding behaviors. It brings you offerings. It defended you in combat. You have corrupted its nature." The Shade Ripper made a low warning sound. Not quite a growl, but close. Its eyes focused on Quillnath with unmistakable intelligence. Dr. Helvin floated forward. "With respect, Director, I must present an alternative interpretation." He activated a holographic display showing biological data. "Our research assumed Shade Rippers were naturally solitary because we only observed them in highly territorial conditions with limited resources. But the data from the past 2 weeks suggests they may actually be social creatures who became aggressive due to artificial scarcity." He pulled up more graphs. "This Shade Ripper's stress hormones have dropped by 60%. Its overall health markers are the best ever recorded for the species. And most interesting, the younger Challenger has begun exhibiting less aggressive behavior in its own territory. It is learning from observing this bonded pair." "That proves my point," Quillnath argued. "Human presence changes natural behavior patterns. All observation changes behavior," Dr. Helvin countered. "The question is whether the change is harmful or beneficial. This creature is healthier and happier than any Shade Ripper in our database. Is that corruption or is that thriving?" The arbiters consulted among themselves in a language Daniel did not recognize. Finally, the lead arbiter spoke again. "Daniel Carter, do you claim to have domesticated this creature?" "No," Daniel said immediately. "I do not own it. I do not control it. I helped it when it was injured because that seemed like the right thing to do. Everything else just happened. But you have bonded with it." Daniel looked at the Shade Ripper beside him, at the intelligent eyes watching the proceedings, at the scars they both carried from defending each other. "Yes, I guess we have." The arbiter turned to the creature. "Can this being understand speech?" The Shade Ripper tilted its head. focusing on the speaker. Then, deliberately, it moved between the council delegation and Daniel. Not aggressive, but clearly choosing a side. It sat down beside Daniel and leaned its massive shoulder against him. The message could not have been clearer. This is my family. This is my choice. Remarkable. Dr. Helvin breathed. Quilneth's scales flushed dark red. This is exactly what I warn against. Humans form inappropriate attachments. They project emotions onto creatures that cannot reciprocate. This entire situation is built on anthropomorphization and manipulation. Is it? The second arbiter spoke for the first time, their voice sharp. Because what I see is a creature making its own decision, expressing clear preference and agency. If we ignore that choice to preserve some idealized version of nature, are we not the manipulators? Silence fell over the clearing. Daniel could hear water running in the stream, wind moving through silver leaves, his own heart beating too fast. Everything balanced on whatever the council decided next. The lead arbiter stepped forward until they stood directly in front of Daniel. We propose the following resolution. You will be permitted to remain on Havros, 9 in this specific territory. Your status will change from condemned prisoner to probationary wildlife researcher. You will document all observations and submit regular reports to Dr. Helvin. Daniel felt his knees go weak with relief. Thank you. I will. However, the arbiter continued, you will never be permitted to leave this planet. Your presence has irrevocably altered local conditions. Removing you now would likely cause distress to the creature you have bonded with. Therefore, you will remain here for the duration of your natural life. Do you accept these terms? Never leave. Never see his sister again. Never walk on Earth. Never go home. Daniel looked at the Shade Ripper beside him, at the creature that should have killed him but instead chose companionship, at the canyon that had become more familiar than any city. I accept. Quilnath made a sound of pure frustration. This sets a dangerous precedent. Other humans will see this and attempt similar bonding with dangerous species across the galaxy. Perhaps, the third arbiter said, or perhaps we will learn that humanity's capacity for empathy is a gift rather than a contamination. Time will tell. The delegation returned to their shuttle. Only Dr. Helvin lingered, floating over to Daniel with something like kindness in his large eyes. I will bring you research equipment next week. Prope supplias. You have a real opportunity here to teach us something we never knew. About Shade Rippers. About connection, Dr. Helvin said gently. About the spaces between species where understanding lives. About choosing compassion when the universe expects violence. The shuttle lifted off, leaving Daniel alone with his companion once more. The Shade Ripper made a questioning sound, sensing the weight of what had just happened. Daniel sat down heavily and let out a long breath. Well, looks like I am staying. The creature lowered its head and nudged him gently in the chest. The same gesture it had made after Daniel first treated its wound. Trust. Family. Home. Daniel wrapped his arms around its neck and let himself feel everything he had been holding back. Relief. Grief for the life he would never return to. Joy for the impossible bond he had found. The Shade Ripper rumbled softly, a sound of comfort. Above them, stars were becoming visible in the evening sky. Somewhere out there was Earth, his sister, everything he used to know. But here was this, a creature that chose him, a canyon that sheltered him, a purpose he never expected. Daniel thought about his grandmother one more time, remembered her smile when a wounded animal finally trusted her touch. She would understand this choice. She would approve. Every creature is just trying to survive, he whispered, including me. The Shade Ripper's answering rumble vibrated through his bones like agreement. 6 months transformed the canyon into something that felt like home. Daniel had built a proper shelter using materials Dr. Helvin brought on supply runs. Solar panels powered a small research station where he maintained detailed logs. A water filtration system meant he no longer had to boil everything. He even had real coffee now, though he rationed it carefully. But the biggest change was not in his living conditions. It was in his family. The Shade Ripper led him deep into the canyon one morning, moving with purpose through sections of forest Daniel had never explored. They walked for hours until the creature stopped before a cave system hidden behind a waterfall. It looked back at Daniel, made an encouraging sound, then disappeared into the darkness. Daniel followed cautiously, using a flashlight from his research kit. The cave opened into a large chamber where bioluminescent moss provided soft blue light. And there, curled together in a nest of leaves and soft grasses, were 3 juvenile shade rippers. They were small, barely 5 feet long, with scales that had not yet developed their full color. When they saw Daniel, their eyes went wide with alarm. But his companion moved between them and the human, making reassuring sounds. Introducing them. This is family. This is safe. Over the next weeks, the juveniles grew bold enough to visit Daniel's camp. They were curious and playful, tumbling over each other and investigating everything with fearless enthusiasm. The smallest one, whose scales showed hints of silver, seemed particularly fascinated by Daniel. It would sit and watch him work for hours, tilting its head at his strange bipedal movements. Daniel documented everything. Feeding patterns, social interactions, the way the adult taught the juveniles to hunt and patrol territory. Dr. Helvin visited monthly now, reviewing the data with barely contained excitement. This changes everything we thought we knew about the species, he said during one visit, watching the juveniles play fight near the stream. Shade rippers are not naturally solitary. They form family units. They teach their young. They cooperate. They were just stressed before, Daniel said, competing for limited territory. No different than any species pushed to survival mode. Exactly. And your presence provided enough stability for natural social behavior to emerge. Dr. Helvin made notes on his data pad. Academic institutions across 3-star systems are requesting access to this research. You are literally rewriting xenobiology textbooks. The younger challengers still patrolled the southern territory. Daniel saw it occasionally, watching from ridge lines. But it had not attacked again. More interesting, it had started leaving the canyon boundaries to hunt rather than fighting for the central territory, as if learning that cooperation provided better outcomes than constant conflict. Then Quillnath arrived unannounced. Daniel was teaching the smallest juvenile to identify safe plants when he heard the shuttle landing. The wildlife director emerged alone, her scales shifting through colors that suggested deep discomfort. She approached the camp slowly, very aware of the adult shade ripper, watching her every move. Director, Daniel greeted carefully. This is unexpected. I came to observe personally. She stopped at the edge of his camp, eyes fixed on the juvenile that had not run from her presence. I have reviewed your reports. Dr. Helvin's analysis. The council's position. But I needed to see for myself. See what? Whether I was wrong. She said it quietly, each word sounding like it cost her something. I built my career on the principle of minimal interference. Observing without touching. Preserving nature in amber. And then you arrived and broke every rule I believed in. The smallest juvenile approached Quillnath with typical fearless curiosity. It sniffed her scaled hand, chirped softly, then bounded back to Daniel. The gesture was so casual, so trusting, that Quillnath actually flinched. They are not afraid, she observed. Why would they be? No one here has hurt them. But we isolated their kind, kept them in territories too small, created scarcity that drove them to violence. Quillnath's scales shifted to pale blue, a color Daniel had learned meant sadness. I thought I was protecting them. Instead, I was making them suffer. Daniel gestured to a log near his fire. Would you like to sit? She did, moving carefully. The adult shade ripper watched, but did not intervene. After a moment, Quillnath spoke again. The council is using your work to revise wildlife preservation protocols across all protected planets. They're calling it the Carter Principle. Observation with compassion, understanding that non-interference can be its own form of cruelty. I just helped an injured animal, Daniel said. Everything else happened on its own. No, you saw an individual where we saw only a species. You recognized suffering where we saw only data. She watched the juveniles play in the stream. That is not nothing. That is everything. They sat in silence for a while. Then Quillnath asked the question Daniel had been expecting. Do you regret staying? Giving up everything you knew, Daniel thought about Earth. About his sister who he would never see again outside of video calls. About cities and rain and 1,000 small things he missed. But he also thought about the weight of a Shade Ripper's head resting against his chest. About the sound of juveniles chirping in the morning. About belonging to something bigger than himself. No, he said simply. I do not regret it. Quillnath nodded slowly. I am beginning to understand why. She left an hour later, but something had shifted. Her reports to the council changed from warnings about contamination to observations about social complexity. She became one of the strongest advocates for Daniel's research. News of the bonded human and Shade Ripper family spread through galactic academic channels. Other stories followed. Humans forming connections with creatures thought untamable, breaking barriers that seemed insurmountable, showing that empathy could cross any biological divide. Daniel received a message from his sister months later. The council had allowed her to send a video. She appeared on his screen, smiling through tears. Hey, little brother. They told me you were alive, that you're staying on some alien planet studying monsters. Of course you are. She laughed and wiped her eyes. Grandma would be so proud. You know that, right? Wherever she is bragging about you to everyone. Daniel watched the message 3 times, memorizing every detail. Then he recorded his response, telling her about the canyon, the Shade Rippers, the impossible family he had found. He ended with their grandmother's words. Every creature is just trying to survive. Turns out that includes me. Evening fell across the canyon like a blanket. Daniel sat by his fire with the adult Shade Ripper on one side and the 3 juveniles piled on the other. They had named him in their own way, a specific pattern of chirps and rumbles that meant family who heals. He wore the name with pride. The stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright in the alien sky. Somewhere among them was Earth. Home in the old sense. But here, surrounded by creatures that should have been his death, Daniel had found home in a new way. Not the place you came from, but the place you belonged. The smallest juvenile made a sleepy sound and pressed closer. Daniel rested his hand on its warm scales, feeling the steady rhythm of breathing. The adult rumbled contentedly. In the distance, the challenger roared, but it sounded more like a greeting now than a threat. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself feel the weight of everything. The life he lost, the life he found, the impossible beauty of connection across the stars. His grandmother had taught him to respect all life. He had learned to love it in forms he never imagined, that a human castaway and a family of apex predators. Proof that compassion could cross any divide. That family was not about species or biology, but about choice and care. That home was wherever you were willing to see another being's suffering and say, I will help. The fire crackled. The juveniles snored softly. The canyon held them all in its ancient embrace. And Daniel, who came to this world to die, had instead learned how to truly live. Every creature was just trying to survive. But survival, he had discovered, was so much sweeter when you did not have to do it alone.